Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox Bultan of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals to state senators to mayors to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about.
In today's episode, we're taking a look at the idea of abundance, first written about, I think, by The Atlantic's Derek Thompson, which is growing in visibility and impact as a policy framework. I'm joined today by Derek Kaufman, the founder and CEO of the Inclusive Abundance Initiative, one of the organizations focused on an abundance agenda, who's building a movement of like-minded policy experts, think tanks, public officials, and advocacy groups to, in their words, foster a more vibrant economy with widespread flourishing. Derek talks about how he defines abundance and how the abundance framework translates to specific policy examples in things like the housing supply, permitting reform, child tax credit, and more. We also look at the relationship between democracy and abundance and why streamlining government functions, whether it's easily paying your taxes or reducing barriers to voting, can restore faith in our institutions, and why he's optimistic that building a center-out bipartisan coalition around abundance can create better outcomes for all Americans. I hope you enjoy. Derek Kaufman, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Thanks for having me.
I've been looking forward to this conversation. You and I have met before and had conversations about your work with your new organization. But I feel like abundance is having a moment here writ large. And so I'm excited to talk to you kind of about what you're doing and this kind of idea of abundance more generally that we're hearing in political circles, in policy circles across the country. So maybe, as I mentioned in the intro, you are the founder and CEO of the Inclusive Abundance Initiative. So maybe just to start with, what is the Inclusive Abundance Initiative?
Thanks for the question. The Inclusive Abundance Initiative is a group that's trying to develop an abundance agenda. This includes supporting and being a thought partner with a variety of people in the think tank and academic world on policy ideas, partnering with public officials and their staffs on learning about both the framing and the specific policy content, and working with other civic leaders to get them engaged on what is, to me, a very exciting opportunity to present an optimistic, cross-ideological framework for thinking about public policy.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about that framing, the messaging framework or the policy framework, if you will, of abundance, because I mentioned, I'm hearing that word a lot, and I bet our listeners are starting to hear it too, which I think you will think is a good thing, of course. But it's a word that maybe not people are familiar with, right? So the way you talk about it, I mean, I was looking at some of your policy partners, as you suggested, and there's an abundance academic network now, an abundance network, a metropolitan abundance project, a number of these groups that people.
There's an abundance of abundance groups.
There is an abundance of abundance groups right now. I love that you made that joke. What do we mean by abundance? When you talk about that, what is it at the heart of that for you?
Right. So the heart of it is finding a way to organize our society to create opportunity in ways that overcome certain inherent limitations in the status quo. A lot of this abundance framing came out of the scarcity that we saw firsthand in the pandemic. So back in 2020 and 2021, you couldn't buy toilet paper, you couldn't buy computer chips, your rent went through the roof because of chronic housing shortages. If you tried to file for unemployment benefits in California, you were unable to do so because the system collapsed under the weight of applications. So there were all of these areas where accumulated regulatory overreach, bureaucratic inefficiency, underinvestment in public good led to these shortages. And in early 2022, Derek Thompson wrote an article in The Atlantic, which I think was the genesis of a lot of the current abundance conversation. And other young thought leaders have joined him, Ezra Klein and Jerusalem Dempsis and Matt Iglesias, to name a few, where we look very closely at everything from why it's so hard to build housing or to deploy clean energy at scale, why government can't hire the talented people that we think it should to do its job, why innovation hasn't met our expectations for what we should be doing in America in 2024. And abundance is a framework to identify and change these bottlenecks in the system or these areas of underinvestment in the system to create a better life for people.
So when you think about, let me say it this way, when I think about abundance, I kind of, what resonates with me is this idea that somehow, we're talking about America as a pie, right? And that kind of there's people who want to talk about it as like, what's the right division of the pie? And so in that case, you're all fighting each other for the pie. So there's a lot of hate and division or, competition and not a good way, as opposed to this idea of kind of growing the pie for everybody, right? That the pie doesn't have to stay the same, but through innovation, through efficiency, through collective effort, all those things, like we can grow the whole pie and everybody can do better, as opposed to this kind of, is that a fair way to think about it, or how would you correct that?
No, I think it's a good first approximation. The devil's probably in the details. So
yeah,
there are a lot of narratives out there that are very scarcity mindset focused. So some of what you hinted at, some of these zero sum mentality things that creep up, and this comes when we're talking about social safety net programs, where does an investment in a kid growing up in poverty come at the expense of everyone else in society because there's a scarce amount of dollars, or do investments like that actually create opportunity for that child to live her best life, which then provides a real return to society?
Right.
Some of the immigration discussion, especially at high skill, has some of this scarcity mindset where there's like a fixed number of jobs. And if one job gets taken out of the bag slowly empties. Whereas a lot of the actual economic work shows that when one job gets taken, it creates one or two other jobs. Because there's spillover effects. And there's also, some from certain sectors, there's been an argument that sustainable growth and prosperity come at the expense of the environment, right? So that there's like a choice you have to make. But as we've seen with the deployment of new clean energy technologies, that choice is not the same as it was 30 years ago and probably is a false choice. So there's a lot of areas where the scarcity narrative is just wrong in terms of economic evidence, but it's not quite so simple as everyone is better off and no one is worse off. So that usually there are examples where right now, one or two very organized special interests who are a little bit worse off by a change that unlocks good for all of society have a disproportionate amount of influence in their ability to block that good. And we can go into some examples. But I feel that the abundance framework is about being honest and transparent about how you weigh those trade-offs and using data and evidence to make choices where we don't just give the loudest person or a well-organized small group of people who are aggrieved the right to stop something that millions of people would diffusely benefit from, but who aren't as well organized.
Yeah. Do you want to talk through one of those examples, maybe to put a little meat on the bones?
Yeah. So I think a good example often comes in housing. If we look back historically, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there were a lot of decisions that were made to build things quickly and at scale that literally bulldozed marginalized communities. And these were tragic choices that didn't take community input into account with real harm. And so we built up a scaffolding of community review process and community input process to prevent that from happening. But now if you look at housing, if someone in a town wants to put up a multifamily apartment building that would let working class people live in their community, the person who shows up for that community meeting might be an older, wealthier homeowner who doesn't want the town to change that way. And the 100 residents of this building that isn't yet built might not even live in the town, first of all, because they can't afford to yet. Even if they did, they might not be able to make it to a 6:30 p.m. evening meeting. They might be taking care of their kids. They might be working a second job. And so we've designed the community process, which was initially meant to protect a certain group of marginalized people. And it actually empowers a small group of people to block what would benefit those groups that we were trying to help. And it becomes a question of, at what level of granularity do you want input versus how do you use elected officials and a regulatory framework that tries to get to yes in a way that benefits more people as the operating model instead.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's really interesting to me that when I was doing a quick kind of landscape review of some of the other abundance organizations, including yours, housing really seems to be a through line as a great example of what you guys are talking about. And also, I assume because people think there's a real opportunity for change here, right? To show a success. So are you optimistic that some of these efforts around housing that seem to be kind of the first big push from the abundance community, and again, correct me if that's not right, but that's how it felt.
No.
We can make some progress? Is that kind of are you optimistic about that?
I think we are making progress. There's some groups doing great work in states. So a lot of housing policy is state and local. A lot of land use and zoning rules are state and local. And there's groups, Welcoming Neighbors Network is one of my favorite, that has campaigns across a variety of states. They've made progress in Montana, where a Republican trifecta passed some really great land use and zoning, through Hawaii, which looks very different than Montana, and then in places like Arizona and North Carolina and other states. So there's great energy there. There are some federal policies that would really help with housing. Mm-hmm. Housing is at the top of people's list because literally it's at the top of people's consumption costs. So when you look, it's the single biggest line item in whether you rent or you own, and it could be anywhere between a quarter and a third on average, and for very rent burdened people up to half of their income. So if you're going to pick one thing where the cost of living implications of fixing it are high, housing is right up there. And so it's been exciting, and hearing the Kamala Harris talk about housing and supply being an issue, hearing Barack Obama talking about housing and supply being an issue, seeing this also on the lips of people like Republican Governor Greg Gianforte in Montana. There is a cross-partisan realization that this is one of the most important issues that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I first of all, I couldn't agree more about housing and people's concerns about it. I mean, as working with state and local leaders all over the country, of course, this is, the thing that comes up probably the most. It's the single biggest use of ARPA dollars, as far as I know, the American Rescue Plan dollars that came to the state and locality piece of that was spent on housing because it is such a huge issue. So you mentioned kind of the fact that there's state efforts going on. Obviously, it very much is a state issue in many ways, but you also mentioned there's some federal obstacles that could be fixed through legislation. I assume permitting being a big one of that, or some of these other things. So how do you think about your work and both working, how do you see what you can best bring to the table in terms of working both federally or in other ways to kind of work on this issue?
Right. So I think a lot of the challenge is that public officials are very busy and their staffs are constantly overworked, and it's important for really good ideas to be curated and amplified in civil society. So, on housing, the country does not have a unified database of land use and zoning. So municipalities have all sorts of local data in terms of what the rules are and what the processes are, but there's not, like we have a monthly payroll report and a monthly retail sales report the federal government produces. There's not a monthly or annual or ever report about what changes to different zoning rules have happened and how those have unlocked more density and more supply and more attainable housing. So one possible thing the federal government could do is help with data gathering. There's also this constant curse where small and medium-sized cities don't usually have the resources that other places have to do really smart upzoning, to know what the best practices are, to see how they compare to other places. And so providing some technical assistance and some grants. And so there are actually a couple of bills that are out there. Brian Schatz and Todd Young, which is again like a Democrat Republican, have a YIMBY Act. There's another bill that's in the Senate and House with Fetterman and Lisa Blunt Rochester trying to provide some of this technical assistance. So there's small bills at the federal level trying to fix this. And then ideally you would design that in conjunction with work done in the states to create more supply of all kinds. And this isn't just about capital A affordable housing or low income housing. That's a piece of the mix, but so is just market rate attainable middle income housing. You look at cities like Austin that have been building a lot of housing, and the affordability there is very different than places like New York and San Francisco that haven't. And what's also interesting is when you look at homelessness as a problem, the cities that aren't building housing have more homelessness, and the cities that are building don't. And so it's both about the affordability for working Americans, but there are downstream effects, throughout the entire population.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like I should put a plug in just for our listeners will know that we also do work on housing, and couldn't agree more on some of the challenges and solutions that need to happen. And so go check out some of our housing resources at newdealleaders.org and newdealforum.org. But so put a little plug in for that. But I agree with you. I agree with you wholeheartedly. You mentioned the campaign, and we are sitting here. What the work that you're going to doing is big and is long term for sure. Like all of us who work in that type of long term work, we also have to work in the political landscape as it is, and we are in a campaign 60 days or whatever it is left, 55 days. So my question to you is: Are you seeing some of these ideas that are being promoted by so many by you and by others in this community? Are you seeing them bubble up? What is exciting you about some of the conversations that are happening in the campaign? You did mention the vice president's focus on housing, and specifically, which I completely concur with, supply of housing, which is not always what's talked about when we talk about housing. We talk about affordability a lot, but we don't talk about supply. So anything you want to expand on that, or are other things that you're seeing that you kind of think, animate these kind of principles that you're talking about?
One of the personal projects I worked on before founding the Inclusive Abundance Initiative was the child tax credit. And this was work that I started doing back in 2015 and 16, just learning about the fact that the current form then and now of the child tax credit was that it was like a gift card you could only redeem at the IRS store. So if you had a tax bill, you could use the tax credit at the IRS. But if you were at the bottom of the income spectrum and didn't have as much of a tax liability, you couldn't do anything with that card. It only was exchangeable for tax credit. So the idea was to make it a refundable tax credit, where basically if you didn't have the tax liability, you could get cash back instead. And worked with a variety of members of Congress and think tanks and other civic leaders to try to change the dialogue on that, because almost all the social science literature showed what an extraordinary return cutting child poverty would provide. And also it was a giant middle class tax cut. If we look at the housing as a number one driver of costs, having a kid is also a huge driver of costs. And lots of people want the freedom to make the choice to have children, but can't do that because of everything from housing through the childcare costs, through not having a tax credit like this that they could get. It was really exciting for me to see, quite frankly, both the Harris-Walz campaign, but also the Trump-Vance campaign talking about the child tax credit. So this is kind of wild. I think that there's major differences in terms of how people have voted and what the details would actually look like. But for there to be the salience of that issue across party lines, where there's a narrative, a conservative case for family values to have more resources to raise your kids, and a progressive case in terms of things like child poverty and expanded middle class tax cuts, that was interesting to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's probably worth just noting. I'm sure our listeners know this, but child child tax credit has shown remarkable results. I mean, you kind of referenced it, but I just want to underscore it, right? I mean, it cut child poverty in half. I mean, so this should be an issue that we can all come together around, just because it's had such a huge success, demonstrable, tangible success. So I agree that, like, hopefully that should not be a partisan issue to get this done again.
And no matter what happens, the TCJA of 2017, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, many of the provisions expire at the end of 2025. So there's going to be a huge tax debate taking place next year. And having the child tax credit be a big part of that debate, given the demonstrable evidence of its success, seems important. And that was something that was exciting. The other thing I'd say that's really interesting, and this is happening concurrent with the election, but in the Senate, Joe Manchin and John Barrasso have a permitting reform bill to make it easier to build and deploy the energy that the Inflation Reduction Act is trying to get on the grid. So the Inflation Reduction Act was passed with a lot of tax credits to have wind and solar and potentially geothermal and nuclear deployed at scale, which is how we're going to combat climate change, by building out a robust network of new energy generation and transmission. But again, it's harder to build than it should be. And just like with housing, getting energy built is challenging. And so this bill it passed 15-4 out of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So it's bipartisan. And it's something that after the election could come up in lame duck. And so that's something that I'm also really excited about. I think that's the energy version of some of the housing things we talked about. So the framing of abundance is definitely gaining momentum, but there are a whole bunch of specific policy changes that are in various states of progress that are pretty exciting.
Yeah. Can we talk for a second about you mentioned it a couple of times, so I want to pull the thread a little bit on the bipartisan or pan-partisan kind of nature of this. I mean, obviously, again, we're in an election year, so and we've got two very distinct choices. So, but looking ahead, there is this kind of conversation about, can we ever get back to a place where there's bipartisan support? Can we ever get back to a place where we can agree on things? And, there's a whole host of reasons for that, media and other things, about why we feel like it's kind of in a hopeless place. But your whole model is really, is pushing this forward, that absolutely we can find bipartisan. You're giving some examples. So what gives you hope that there's actually a way forward here, that we can come together on some of these reform issues?
Right. So this is a great question. First of all, if we look back, the infrastructure bill and CHIPS and Science were large bipartisan bills. CHIPS and Science had regional tech hubs in it, which was another project that I had worked on before Inclusive Abundance, trying to bring economic development back to small and medium-sized cities that had been left behind over the last few decades of globalization and automation. So that there have been examples. The environment is obviously very polarized and very hot. And what's nice about the abundance framework is there are a lot of wonky, more boring system solutions that don't create the same kind of emotional intensity as the divisive social issues are. And so one thing that's interesting to me, if I ask someone their views on gun control, I can probably tell you their views on abortion and a whole host of other social issues. Right? There's a deep correlation between these. If I ask someone their view on having more housing, or having a energy abundance, or making government work better, or having better innovation policy, that doesn't correlate nearly as much to those views on the social issues. Not to say that the social issues aren't extremely important. They're extremely important, but to imagine there's going to be like a bipartisan agreement on those is very hard to do. But to imagine that across the parties, you could develop factions, Democratic faction, or Republican faction of pro-abundance ideas, and they'll talk about them differently. So the permitting bill on energy has some fossil fuel provisions in it, which are pretty small. Most of them are natural gas, that some on the far left didn't like, because they would like it to just be clean energy. And Some people on the right don't like how much clean energy is in the bill. They wanted, more fossil fuel. So to get something to be bipartisan, that's at the end of a process where people are making a deal. But before you get to the bipartisan deal, how can you cultivate a set of great ideas that resonate with Republicans on these abundance issues? And how can you, in parallel, create a aligned but not exactly overlapping set of ideas in the Democratic Party? And then build the momentum in terms of the narrative change, in terms of the political incentives, in terms of the policy ideas, so that when the moment is right, you can get things like chips and science to happen, or the infrastructure bill to happen, or permitting reform to happen. And defining something up front as necessarily bipartisan, you're basically looking for the lowest common denominator that's achievable today. But if you run in parallel faction-based ideas in the two parties and really build a lot of momentum and have conversation and dialogue about, I love this thing that you don't hate, and you love this thing that I don't hate, and we can trade one for the other there, versus identifying something we both love today, right? You can open up the aperture of what is possible. And so I'm optimistic about that going forward, although building a movement around these abundance ideas is going to take time. And, hopefully we're trying to find as many people to join it as possible.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting way to talk about it, actually. And I mean, I do feel like, again, kind of just with my personal hat on here as a center-left leader of a center-left organization, you've heard me say this, but I'll say it again, is this idea that on the Democratic side, at least, for those of us on the Democratic side who I believe we think the government can do good things, right? Government has a role to play here, but for those of us who believe in that, we have a special responsibility to make government work well, right? And I think there's people on the center right who, similarly have that kind of bent. So I really like what you were talking about with this idea of like, let's not start from that's something we both love. Let's start from something that I love and you are okay with, and vice
Right.
versa. And maybe we can, again, grow that pie, right, of what we're able to talk about even. So I think that's interesting. I wanted to get to one other just kind of policy or area that I know you've talked about through your organization, and I want to make sure I save a minute for just an interesting way of kind of how you got to this work. But so I know that we talked a lot about economic policy. You do talk on your website and talk in your organization about democracy as part of this whole abundance framework. So can you want to fill in the blanks there about how you apply the abundance framework when we think about democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you asked. We all know that trust in our institutions, people's opinion of Congress, this has been on a steady secular decline. And there's almost like a vicious cycle between polarization, lack of trust in the institutions, and then people feeling like democracy isn't delivering for them. And most people, when they get out of bed in the morning, aren't thinking about our democracy. Right? They're thinking about making it through the day and getting their kids to school and getting a promotion at their job and being able to pay the bills. Democracy is a little bit of an abstract luxury to contemplate. When you revitalize the functioning of our institutions, so if you could seamlessly file your taxes and they could be pre-populated with your income, and that would then enable you to also access your benefits to which you're eligible. And you could imagine one portal where you had this great experience with government. You could even tell a story where that minimized benefit fraud at the same time, because you'd have a ID verification, tax filing, and benefit enrollment all together as kind of a bargain between the left and the right. This would change people's perception of what government does. When we look at this moment of artificial intelligence, like getting these tools used and deployed to make government work better, doing the research so that we understand how to benchmark the tools, how to test them, how to make sure that they're safe and staying contained. These are all areas where the government could make real investments in both talent and research to meet the moment of this transformative technology. If we look at how primaries work, the partisan primaries with low turnout that produce extreme candidates who then make it through the general and the very polarized places, the sort of super slanted places. This gets on TV and social media, lots of people with loud voices, but that's not what people want their government to look like. So from everything to reforming how elections take place, reforming how our institutions work, making government service delivery more seamless, this kind of policy agenda, the hope and the data suggest will influence people's perception of democracy and make concrete what this abstraction otherwise is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Hear, hear. Amen on that. I think a functioning and a working government is a prerequisite to a functioning democracy. So I think that's exactly right.
And but again, for Democrats, where the proposal is government will make a positive difference in your life, to make government work better, to have more talented people in government, to have better procurement where we aren't, there's a lot of procurement decisions that are very inefficient that happen because of how policy is legislated and because of culture and norms and agencies and because of oversight. So making procurement better, making hiring and talent better, these are things that could really help the Democratic Party. And I'm constantly surprised at how little airtime improving the functioning of our government gets from the Democrats.
Yeah.
On the Republican side, there's frustration with these inefficiencies, and then there's a desire to just kind of rip it apart. But I believe that there's a lot of energy in the Republican Party that could be a partner on making it work better. But we need to have some concrete ideas for these reforms, and that they're out there, they're floating around, and I'm pushing hard on that government capacity and institutional innovation thread of abundance. Seems very promising.
Yeah, I agree. So you had a pretty successful career, taking a little bit of a turn here on how you got here. In the private sector, a very successful career in the private sector. You started dipping your toe a little bit in politics and working on some of these policies, and now you have, really jumped in with both feet to start your own organization and to dedicate yourself to this. Tell me about that evolution. What is it that kind of said, I'm gonna take what I learned and apply it, or I'm gonna go come back and serve, if it really is kind of what you're doing. What was your thinking about why now and what you're hoping to do?
Thank you for those comments. The career at Wall Street for 20 years was very much building teams of domain experts who knew much more about the piece of their market than I would ever know, or much more about how to build a model of how a certain financial instrument behaved, or how to design a risk management system or a financial transaction operation system. And it was hiring these people and providing a common sense of purpose and a culture of innovation, and then prioritizing how to give them a platform that let them thrive in the most efficient way possible. And the goal of that was, of course, earning good returns in the financial markets. The method is actually very similar to policy entrepreneurship. And about 9 years ago, when I left the industry to spend some time with my kids and to let my wife, who's an amazing public health researcher, have her career take off, I began to learn my way around what kind of work is being done in think tanks, where the congressional staff capacity could use some augmentation with people sitting in think tanks, how to build those bridges, how to get other civic leaders excited about things like the child tax credit or the regional tech hubs and chips in science, and convening business leaders and philanthropists, policy experts and public officials and their staffs together around these common goals. And I did that for about 8 years. What I learned is that can be a very effective way to do philanthropy. A lot of people think about philanthropy as a direct grant to a food bank or to a hospital or to an educational institution. And as an example, Robin Hood, which is a poverty fighting organization in New York, for years had done an amazing job of granting money to social service organizations in New York. But in 2016, when I started talking to Robin Hood about policy work, they weren't quite ready to do it. And then they hired this guy named Wes Moore, who's the current governor of Maryland, to run Robin Hood for 4 years. Well, they hired him to run Robin Hood. He did that until he entered the primary to become governor of Maryland. And Wes and I sat down early on and talked about the child tax credit and how in 1 year, a fully refundable child tax credit would bring about $3 billion to kids in New York City in poverty, which was the entire 30-year cumulative amount of grants that Robinhood had given out. And so when you look at the scale of government versus the scale of the philanthropic sector, it's very hard to solve any societal problem anywhere near the order of magnitude of resources it takes provided just by philanthropy. But philanthropy can be nimble. It can gather data and evidence. It can design policies. It can educate policymakers. It can change the narrative. And by doing those things, and as specific examples, we sponsored research at Columbia on the cost and benefits of child poverty that President Biden tweeted when he passed the American Rescue Plan and changed the child tax credit. Right? So there is an enormous amount of leverage in policy philanthropy. That was something that I found so profoundly exciting. And learning how to do it is what led me to create the Inclusive Abundance Initiative.
And if the Inclusive Abundance Initiative is successful over the next pick of time frame, 5 years, 10 years, whatever, what do you feel like that will look like?
Number one, it's going to be about both passing and implementing abundance legislation at the federal and state and local levels. We have a C4 that's working on the kind of pointy end of the spear there. That's Inclusive Abundance Action. The Inclusive Abundance Initiative, which is the 501c3, so it's a nonpartisan, is working on building expert networks and supporting their work to create these ideas and educate the public about the ideas. The 5-year forward vision would be that there are vibrant factions in both parties excited about the abundance frame and working on abundance policies, that the narrative has shifted in society so that we aren't constantly thinking about a zero-sum framing or a scarcity framing, but that we are recognizing with data and evidence that there are policy choices available to us that will materially make it more affordable for people to live, will have energy abundance, and will have a better functioning and more innovative government. And I would hope that this is going to be something that accumulates, and so that there are near-term wins in the next year or two, and that we have increasingly viable high-level discussions about this. But I will say so far it's been really exciting. Like the fact that we have major candidates talking about these policies already, the fact that there's so much energy and excitement around them is very satisfying to see at this early stage.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Well, we appreciate your partnership and so these conversations we're having with NewDEAL and your organization and all of the work that you've done on so many important issues. And I really appreciate you taking some time to come with me to talk about it today on the podcast.
Well, thank you. Guys are great. And this ecosystem of pragmatic, public service oriented people who are working tirelessly to make the world better is an incredibly encouraging thing. So thank you for what you do.
Well, thank you very much. Great to see you.
Great to see you.
An Honorable Profession is a NewDEAL Leaders podcast. Thanks to the team at NewDEAL for producing this episode. We encourage you to bring honor to public service, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars are used in the making of this podcast.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,